Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salah ad-Deen al-Ayyubi, Volume 3, The Battle of Hattin, the Conquest of Jerusalem, and the Third Crusade. Start of Part 4 of Chapter 3. The Fall of Acre. Salah ad-Deen was watching these developments from his headquarters at Shaf-Amr, then from Kharuba, and then from Al-Ayadiyah. At the end of Jamadiul Awwal, that is June, he received new reinforcements from Mesopotamia, whereupon he launched a number of counterattacks against the Crusaders. The Crusaders began attacking his troops, but they failed to achieve any goal after the Muslims stood up to them with great patience and steadfastness. The aim of the fighting was to gauge the strength of the opponent. Salah ad-Din wanted to prove to Richard the Lion-Hearted that his army was still strong and that he could stand up to him. As for Richard the Lion-Hearted, for his part, he wanted to find out whether he was able to impose his will on Salah ad-Din by force of arms, or force him to negotiate after inflicting defeat on the Muslims, and to agree to his conditions. At the same time, he realized that military circumstances were on his side. The repeated attacks launched by the Muslims on the Crusaders who were besieging Acre had not succeeded. But the fact that they stood firm in the face of counterattacks prompted Richard the Lion-Hearted to seek negotiations, and he announced his desire to meet the Sultan. He was hoping to reach a peaceful settlement, but Salah ad-Din responded cautiously. It is not wise for two hostile kings to meet until a truce has been drawn between them. Nevertheless, he expressed his readiness to allow his brother Al-Adil to meet the English king, and it was decided to halt the fighting for 3 days. It was agreed to hold a meeting in the plain that separated the Muslim and Crusader camps, but it so happened that both the King of England and the King of France fell sick suddenly, and Richard the Lion-Hearted's sickness got worse. But that did not affect the morale of the Crusaders, who grew more determined and more evil. Negotiations for the handover of Acre. In fact, the attacks launched by Salah ad-Din against the Crusader forces did not succeed. Acre had grown very weak and the pressure on the Muslims inside the city had intensified. The Crusader mangonels had destroyed parts of its walls and weakened another part. Effort and sleeplessness had exhausted the people of the city, because their numbers were too few and their efforts were too great. In 7 Jamadi-ul-Sani, that is 2nd July, the garrison sent a letter which stated, "We have reached a point where we are too weak to do anything but surrender, which we will do tomorrow. If you do not do anything, we will ask for safety and surrender the city, and save only ourselves." This news was the worst thing that the Muslims could hear, because Acre was a large depot of weapons for the coast, as well as for Jerusalem, Damascus, Aleppo, and Egypt. In it were the senior emirs of Salah ad-Din, such as Saif ad-Din Ali ibn Ahmad al-Hakari, who was known as al-Mashtub, and Bahar ad-Din Qaraqush. Moreover, the garrison had effectively taken the decision to stop fighting. Saif ad-Din al-Mashtub himself went to the Crusader camp to meet the French king and reach an agreement with him on the terms of surrender. He reminded him that when the Muslims captured a city from the Crusaders and other people in the city asked for safety, it would be granted to them, and he offered to surrender the city to him in return for a guarantee of safety to the people inside. The King of France, who was totally lacking in the gallantry and chivalry for which Salah ad-Deen was known, refused to respond to his request, and responded in a way which was indicative of his harshness, which provoked Saif ad-Din al-Mashtub to speak harshly to him. He told the king, "We will never surrender the city until we are all killed, and none of us will be killed until we kill 50 of your leaders." Then al-Mashtub left and entered Acre, where he urged the people to engage in jihad and give their souls for the sake of Allah. Despite that stubbornness of the King of France, the Crusaders undoubtedly regarded the Muslim forces as something to be reckoned with. According to Ibn al-Athir, the Crusaders were not content to negotiate only with the leader of the Muslim garrison in Acre. They also negotiated with Salah ad-Din himself. They sent word to him about the issue of surrender, and he agreed to it on condition that the Muslims in Acre be allowed to leave, and he would in turn release an equal number of Crusader prisoners in the city. Salah ad-Din urges the Muslims in Acre to be steadfast. Whatever the case, when Salah ad-Din saw the stubbornness of the Crusaders, he sent word to the Muslims in Acre urging them to be patient, and enjoining them to come out of the city altogether after charging at the enemy as one man. He promised them that he himself would meet them at the site where they came out with his troops, and he would fight the Crusaders so that they would be able to come out and join him. However, that attempt was not successful, because the Crusaders were in control of the city. At this point, the Muslims inside Acre realized that they had no choice except jihad and fighting hard against the enemy. So they wrote to Salah ad-Din telling him that they had pledged to fight to the death, and that they had resolved to continue fighting and would never surrender so long as they were still alive. Despite that great sacrifice on the part of the people of Acre, and their love for martyrdom for the sake of Allah, it seems that Salah ad-Din and his emirs who were inside the city, such as the Emir Saif ad-Din al-Mashtub and others, were very keen to save Muslim lives. This is indicated by what is said that when Saif ad-Din al-Mashtub saw the situation, he went out to the Crusaders a second time and decided with them to hand over the city in return for allowing the Muslims inside to come out with their wealth and their lives. And he would pay them a sum of 200,000 dinars and 500 prisoners, in addition to returning the true cross and paying a sum of money to Conrad de Montferrat, ruler of Tyre. Crusader treachery and breaking of the deal. The Crusaders accepted this agreement and swore on oath to Saif ad-Din al-Mashtub, so he handed the city over to them, and they entered it peacefully. However, when the Crusaders entered Acre, they broke their agreement as usual and betrayed the Muslims in the city, capturing them, seizing their possessions and putting them in prison. That occurred on 17 Jamadi-ul-Sani, 587 Hijri, that is July 1191 Common Era. They gave the excuse that they did that so that they could receive what had been agreed upon in terms of ransoms and prisoners. At this point, Salah ad-Din began to collect money, of which he collected a large amount, and he consulted his companions about handing it over to the Crusaders. They suggested that he should go back again and ask the Crusaders to swear an oath that they would release his companions, and said that the Templars should guarantee that because they were religious men and honest. However, the Templars refused to do that and said, "We will not swear an oath and we will not guarantee anything, because we are afraid of the betrayal of those who are with us." When Salah ad-Din became aware of their treachery, he did not go through it. At that point, the banners of the Crusaders were flying above the towers of Acre, and the Crusaders managed to enter Acre after besieging it for nearly 2 years, which sent a wave of grief and sorrow among the Muslims, as expressed by their historians. It seems that the Crusaders delayed implementing their side of the deal. Salah ad-Deen had sent the first installment of the money and captives, but when he asked them to do their part in full they refused, at which point he realized that they had decided to break the deal, and he refused to hand over to them the remaining men and captives. When Richard the Lion-Hearted saw that Salah ad-Deen had stopped handing over money and captives, and was not going to hand over the true cross to them, he stopped contacting Salah ad-Deen. Richard's recklessness and foolishness prompted him to drive the Muslim prisoners who were in Acre, of whom there were around 3,000, to Ayadiyah, where he tied them up. Then the Crusaders attacked them all at once and killed every single one of them. That massacre occurred on 27 Rajab 587 Hijri, that is 20th August 1191 Common Era. Undoubtedly, that cruel action taken by Richard against the Muslim prisoners in Acre could have no outcome other than provoking the zeal of the Muslims, who realized the danger posed by the Crusaders, so they rushed from all parts of the Muslim world to join the jihad against the Crusaders. Indeed, the Muslim armies prevented the Crusader armies from achieving any victory after they entered Acre. That was because of the steadfastness of the Muslim armies in the field of battle, as they sensed the increasing danger posed by the Crusaders. The entry of the Crusaders into Acre was also followed by differences and divisions among their leadership, which led to their disunity and inability to achieve any further victories after Acre. That victory was in no way comparable to all the losses that befell the Crusaders. There was a great difference between the savage attitude of Richard towards the Muslim prisoners in Acre and the humane approach that Salah ad-Deen took with the Crusaders on many occasions. These included his treatment of the Crusader prisoners following his victory at Hattin, and his subsequent capture of Jerusalem, as he was always keen to allow the Crusaders in the cities that he captured to leave safely. There is abundant anecdotal evidence of the Islamic humane conduct demonstrated by Salah ad-Deen during this siege of Acre, some of which is related below. The Christian woman searching for her infant son. Among the Muslims, there were thieves who would enter enemy tents and steal from them, even kidnapping people and then leaving. One night they took a 3-month-old infant. When his mother realized that he was missing, she stayed up all night wailing and crying. When news of her plight reached their kings, they told her, "He, meaning Salah ad-Deen, is compassionate. We give you permission to go to him, so go and ask him and he will give the child back to you." So she went out and asked the Muslim scouts for help, telling them about the situation. They took her to the Sultan, so she came to him as he was riding at Tel Kharuba. Al-Qadi ibn Shaddad was with him, and he is the one who narrated the story. There were a lot of people around him, and she wept greatly and rubbed her face with dust. He asked about her, so they told him her story and he felt sorry for her. His eyes overflowed with tears, and he ordered that the infant be brought. So they went and found that he had been sold in the marketplace. He ordered that his price be repaid to the one who had bought him, and the child was taken from him. He, may Allah have mercy on him, remained standing until the child was brought and handed over to her. She took him, weeping greatly, and clasped him to her bosom as the people were looking on and weeping, and I was standing in the midst of them. She breastfed him for a while, Then he ordered that she be placed on a horse and taken back to their camp with her child. Look at this compassion, which included all of mankind. Dealing with the King of England. Many letters came from the Franks to the Sultan, but they were all a waste of time. The King of England asked to meet him, and then he changed his mind. Then the king's envoy came asking permission to give gifts of birds of prey that had been brought from overseas. The king had grown weak, however, and changed his mind, wanting to receive instead chickens and other birds that they themselves could eat in order to grow strong. Only after that would the birds of prey be given as a gift to Salah ad-Deen. Salah ad-Deen understood that Richard needed that for himself, because he had just recovered from sickness. Then Richard sent a Maghribi prisoner whom he had with him, and the Sultan Salah ad-Deen set him free. Then the king sent word asking for fruit and ice, and the Sultan sent it to him. Reasons for the Fall of Acre. There were many reasons which in combination led to the terrible fall of Acre, after the Muslims had defended it for nearly 2 years. Perhaps the most important of them were the following. Arrival of new European forces. The arrival of reinforcements from Europe tipped the balance in favor of the Crusaders, despite the fact that large numbers of them had been killed. Innumerable fresh troops reached them by sea from many nations that participated in this huge Crusader campaign. Princes prepared themselves for it by means of the wealth and equipment that they had. The Italian cities took it upon themselves to give their help and take part in the transfer of troops and equipment, not letting the Muslim ships bring any supplies or equipment that were needed in the besieged city. Their naval superiority was clear. The city resisted the Crusader siege for 2 whole years, during which it witnessed the most intense military operations, in which the Crusaders took part with more than 250,000 troops. The Crusaders had the advantage during this siege because of their strong fleet and huge war machines. Crusaders' use of various new weapons. During the Battle of Acre, the Crusaders used many kinds of weapons and war machines, both ancient types and those that they improved, whether to attack and breach the walls of the city, or to defend themselves behind the walls and trenches that they had built, to prevent Salah ad-Deen's forces reaching them. After a lengthy standoff, sandwiched between the walls of Acre and the troops of Salah ad-Deen, they managed to create gaps in the walls. In a letter prepared by Al-Qadi al-Fadil and sent by Salah ad-Deen to the Abbasid Caliph, he announced that the Crusaders fought sometimes with towers, sometimes with mangonels, sometimes with testudos or battering rams, sometimes by drilling and boring, even fighting at night, sometimes by filling in the trenches and sometimes by setting up ladders, sometimes charging by night and by day, and sometimes attacking by sea in boats. Richard's men were able to breach the walls by means of a new-fangled invention, which they called the cat, as well as with mangonels, which could throw huge rocks that shook the walls and sent shock waves wherever they fell in the city. A lengthy siege. The length of this siege by land and by sea exhausted the Muslims, despite the system that Salah ad-Deen had introduced of alternating the troops by sending replacements into the city. But he was unable to continue that, especially when the Crusaders intensified their siege of the city. The successes achieved by Salah ad-Deen's army that beset the Crusaders from time to time, especially at the beginning of the Crusader siege, were of no benefit. The inevitable outcome was a slowdown in making real efforts. Then the commanders began to complain about Salah ad-Deen, and their complaints soon became a habit and developed into criticism and then into opposition, and that weakened the Muslim ranks. In a letter to the Abbasid Caliph, the Sultan explained the situation with regard to Acre. He described how the emirs withdrew, one after another, because the lengthy period and heavy costs had undermined their ability, but not their willingness, and had sapped their physical strength but not their courage. So their clothes had worn out, their weapons had become blunt, and their money had run out at a time when the sea was bringing reinforcements to the Franks in ship after ship, seemingly as numerous as the number of waves of the sea. If the Muslims killed one crusader on land, they would send 1,000 to replace him, and if one group of them was wiped out, larger groups came to replace them. The Sultan did not regret anything as much as he regretted the absence of his nephew, Taqi ad-Din Umar, who had gone to his emirate in Mesopotamia on the condition that he return soon. But events in his emirate had kept him from returning quickly. Salah ad-Din believed that the absence of Taqi ad-Din was one of the main factors that led to the fall of Acre. Financial woes in Salah ad-Din's army. The lengthy conflict with the Crusaders and the fall of Acre highlighted the financial weak points in Salah ad-Din's army. It is known that Salah ad-Din did not pay sufficient attention to financial matters, and he did not save money for the time of need, and he justified his generous spending, for which he was known, by saying that the circumstances of jihad dictated it. His Highness spent the wealth of Egypt to conquer Syria. He spent the wealth of Syria to conquer Mesopotamia, and he spent the wealth of all his empire to conquer the coast. He quickly found himself in urgent need of money to pay for weapons, food supplies, fodder, equipment, and troop salaries. He was also unable to reduce the burden of financial hardship among the troops stationed in Acre, who were forced to take loans. He was also unable to bring in new horses and weapons to replace those that had been worn out. The horses were exhausted by jihad, and the equipment had lost its effectiveness, and had deteriorated beyond repair. They had run out of arrows. The quivers were empty. Al-Isfahani added that there was a need during those years for quantities of weapons. The craftsmen and laborers could not meet this need. These are the most important causes that led to the fall of Acre. End of part 4 of chapter 3.